Hi. So, I realized not that long ago that that a lot of my previous interviews are no longer available, and there's kind of this new surge of detransitioners, which I think is great. I don't think it's great that they have experienced issues, but the fact that they are speaking out is fantastic. But um, I realized that maybe it seems kind of strange for me to be commenting on things if people don't really know my story. So I thought maybe I would kind of reshare um, what I've gone through. And a part of that is that this month, I actually reached the same amount of time detransitioned that I had spent transitioned. So I spent almost 6 years identifying as a trans man and living that life. And I've spent nearly 6 years out of that. So I thought it was kind of momentous to be like, hey, I've been out of this now as long as I was in it. Let me reflect on what happened and what I've learned from that experience and what I've learned over the years as a detransitioned woman also. So in this video, it might be a little bit long. I am going to go over some parts of my history that are kind of hard to hear. So I am going to be talking about childhood abuse and sexual assault, as well as like mental health struggles. If you're not in a place to hear that, I totally understand. But now would be a good time to stop the video because I'm going to try to start from early days and kind of the things that impacted me. So, and please bear with me because I know this is going to be a long video. I have a lot to drink here because my voice, as some of you may know, doesn't last very long thanks to testosterone use. So I am probably going to be taking sips of water and coffee repeatedly. If you hear any noise in the background, I apologize. My bird is in the other room and we're running the dishwasher. I did test the audio, it didn't seem too bad, but if it's distracting, I do apologize. So it's hard to like find a place to start. Ever since I was about 5 years old, I remember being a little bit different than the other girls. Some of that was that I was a tomboy wife and have kids. I knew I didn't want that life from a pretty early age. I didn't know what that really meant for me. I didn't know what gay or straight meant, and I hadn't developed my own sexual orientation or understanding of sexual orientations anyway. So it was all very vague. But I did have a lot of feelings of being different. I preferred to play outside and climb trees. And I grew up in a fundamentalist Christian home where gender roles were very strictly enforced. So I was told from a very early age, girls don't do this, girls don't play with these toys, girls like dresses, girls like Barbies, girls like to play with mom in the kitchen and bake stuff, which, I did like some of that, but not as much as I liked other things. So it gave me kind of a confusing message that I was a girl, but I didn't enjoy these things as much as I was supposed to. Being raised in that environment also came with a lot of homophobia. Again, I didn't know what that meant from a very early age. But growing up in it, I understood that women who wore men's clothes or behaved in ways that were not traditionally feminine were bad for some reason. So that was like kind of instilled in my head from a very young age. Um, I also, when I was 4 years old, my father started to sexually abuse me. And I didn't know that it was abuse for a while. Um, it wasn't until I was 12 that I told anybody about it because I thought it was relatively normal. Part of that was that one of my best friends in the church that we grew up in, she was also abused by her stepfather. And so I kind of got this understanding that that's just what happens. And I didn't understand at the time that it was just pervasive sexual abuse from the church. Um, and when I was 12, I did finally tell somebody about it. And I was met with a lot of aggression. Members of the church sat me down and asked me why I was lying about my father. They said that Satan was causing me to act this way and go against my father, who was in our church. They taught that the father of the house is God of the house. So anything he does or says is what God would say or do. And so I, the woman that I told about this, she got the cops involved. Now, unfortunately, a number of the cops were also members of our church, and those ones took over our case, or took over my case, and they dismissed it essentially, and said that I was lying and acting out. So that created a great like mistrust in me for adults and authority. And it also kind of reinforced this idea in my head that what was happening to me was normal and was okay, and that my body was not mine to control or set boundaries for. And that was something that I have struggled with all my life now because of that. So going into my teens, I ended up developing an eating disorder. I had, and still struggle with anorexia, and it was really all about trying to have control, because it did feel like my body was not mine. And so it felt like this was the only way that I could have sort of some control over myself. And as I was growing into being a teenager, I started dressing a lot more feminine because I felt that that was what was expected of me. I did, however, rebel a little bit. I dressed as a goth kid, so I wore kind of crazy outfits, still feminine, but kind of outlandish outfits. And I really struggled with my autonomy and feeling like I wasn't kind of doomed to be this thing that I didn't want to be. And I didn't know what that meant at the time. I just knew I was trying to fit into something that wasn't natural for me. When I was 14, that's when I met this young man who was 19, and he convinced me that he was my boyfriend, and then subsequently raped me. Um, I Because my reaction to that was very negative. Um, he abused me and said that it was my duty as his girlfriend to do that, and um, that I'll have to do that for any man if I want a man to love me. And that, again, just reinforcing this feeling I had that um, I couldn't decide things for myself, and that my body was not something that I could define barriers for. Um, so that really messed me up, um, even more than I already was. Um, and my mental health was just terrible. From the age of 12, I had been in therapy for depression and suicidality. My first suicide attempt was actually at 7 years old. I overdosed on a bunch of medications. Um, but I my mental health just really tanked when I was in high school. And so I was seeing a psychiatrist and a therapist by the time I was about 16, 17. And that's when I had run the gamut of diagnoses. I've been diagnosed with bipolar. For a while, they thought ADHD, but I don't fit into that category. They also thought for a little while maybe autism spectrum. But the psychiatrist I saw, she was really fantastic. She did a lot of testing, a lot of really thorough examination of me. And she took into account my history of abuse, but she determined that I had paranoid schizophrenia. And it sounds like that kind of came out of nowhere, but I'd had a lot of delusional thinking and paranoia. And it stemmed from real issues, but then my brain took it a step further. And then in my teens, I started hallucinating pretty bad. I had really, really bad delusional thinking, thinking things like I could see spirits and stuff like that. And some of that I know people might attribute to being young, and just kind of, that magical thinking that you have when you're a young person. But anyway, I'm not, that's not what this video is about. I'm not debating my diagnoses. So I was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, as it was at the time. It has since evolved. And I was supposed to be medicated for it, but my parents were not on board with that. So I was on some antidepressants, but that was about it. And then when I was 17, my father and my mother had separated when I was about 16. And when I was 17, my father, he told me that he knew that I was gay. I'd had a girlfriend in high school. I tried really hard to keep it a secret. And I had told my friends in high school that I was bisexual, but I tried really hard to keep that part of my life a secret from my father. He was extremely homophobic. But when I was 17, he told me he would never have a gay daughter. he didn't want to ever hear from me again or see me again, and that I was kicked out. So I had to decide very quickly where to go. Now, I had never been allowed to have a job because it was my responsibility to take care of my younger sister. And so I had tried to get a job, but my father called my potential employer and told them I was not allowed to work there. Um, and so they fired me. Um, and so I had no money. I didn't really feel comfortable at the time telling my friends that I needed a place to stay. I was scared. And he told all of my extended family in that area that I was, he told them that I was addicted to methamphetamines and that I was stealing money from him to buy drugs. This was not true. I had never done drugs. I drank occasionally, but I never done anything really that serious. So he told them this so that they would distance themselves from me and not believe anything I said. And it worked. When I reached out to them, they told me I was a disappointment, that they wished that I had never been a part of the family. And so I didn't have anywhere to go. But my mother, who lived in another state, she told me I could come live with her. So I moved out of state. And once I moved in with her, I did feel a little bit liberated at first. Now, because I was finally out of this like really strict religious and homophobic environment that my father hadn't implemented, and I was living with my mother, I felt like I could kind of explore a little bit, but by this point, the damage was kind of already done. I decided I could never live with myself being gay. And that I had to find a way to force myself to be straight. And so I tried really hard to be with men. I ended up in a very violent, abusive relationship with a man. He actually tried to kill me. He stalked me for years and was extremely abusive. And I was lucky to get away with my life. He was incredibly violent. And that, again, he, in his abuse, he raped me a number of times. And so that was more of me feeling like I couldn't control my body and that men had more control over my body than I did. And then some years went by. I experienced a number of other sexual assaults and rapes. I was drugged and raped a number of times by separate people. Some of that could be said that, I really, I kind of got to a point where I didn't expect anything different. I almost didn't care. I sort of just felt like that's what was supposed to happen, was I was supposed to be treated this way by men. And I my suicidal ideation never went away, but it definitely got much worse in my late teens and early 20s. When I was 21, I when I was 21, I was sexually assaulted, and it it was at work, and it was by a senior employee who was there, and I ended up fighting it for the first time in a really long time. Um, and he ended up losing his job. And I felt good about that, but something something about it being at work, um, like just flipped something in my brain. I don't know how to explain it well, but knowing that not only was I not safe in relationships or having friendships with men, but knowing that I wasn't safe at work, um, I wasn't safe on the street. I'd been sexually assaulted on the street, just waiting for a bus. Um, you know, it felt like I couldn't escape it. It was everywhere. Um, and so something in me just kind of flipped, and I was really questioning, like, how do I escape this? How do I get out of this situation? I don't want to be treated this way anymore. Um, Around that time, I started to kind of tiptoe out of the closet and date women, and exclusively women. Um, and I had a few relationships that were okay, um, and just sort of ended for various reasons. Um, but I went on a dating site, and that's where I met this trans identified man. Um, but he didn't tell me in our messages, and he had altered his photos. So I didn't know at first that he was a man. And when we met, I was kind of taken aback, and I was like, "So, I'm only interested in dating women." And he told me, "Well, that's bigoted, and you need to open yourself up to dating trans women." And I had never met anyone that I knew who was trans, so I was kind of like, "Oh, okay. Well, I want to be a better person. Like, I don't know how I feel about dating you, but like, tell me more about what it means to be trans and all that." And he really, really pushed himself on me. Really guilted me a lot for not wanting a sexual or romantic relationship with him. And I was pretty straightforward that, like, well, I'm fine with being friends, but I don't want to be with you. And he would tell me, like, well, you're not really a lesbian if you're not willing to date a trans woman, which doesn't make any sense. Looking back, it's like, that's ridiculous. But it's what he told me, and I was so new to kind of myself that I was like, I'm questioning everything. I don't know what's what. So maybe I'm wrong about being a lesbian, because I'm not willing to date a trans woman. Um, and he he explained a lot about being trans from his perspective, but then he told me I should talk to people who were women who transitioned, to get a different perspective on it. And so I started looking on YouTube, and for a lot of people these days, it seems like a lot of it starts on like Tumblr or even more recently TikTok. Um, but I didn't ever get involved in those social media sites. I got involved in YouTube. And so I saw a number of videos from trans men on YouTube. Um, and they talked about how they had struggled with being a lesbian, and it was because they weren't really lesbians. they were actually men, um, and that they'd had histories of sexual abuse and sexual assaults, and they'd had history of eating disorder and depression and all these things that I was like, oh wow, like I relate a lot to that. Um, so I sort of took it as um, having so much in common with them. If this solution was working so well for them, maybe it would work well for me. And I reached out to a few of them, and we had some private conversations outside of YouTube, where like we emailed back and forth. Um, and they told me a little bit more specifically about their history, how long they had been transitioning for, and things like that. And really, it was a lot of praise for transition. I don't want to say it's not, I don't think, as black and white as people on the outside really see it. It's not like people are saying like, you better do this. Like, you better do this. This is the only way you're going to be happy. That's not exactly how it worked for me, at least. The way they talked about it, they were like, well, like you really need to like process some of this and like talk with a therapist. But like ultimately, like this is probably what would be good for you. Um, and they framed it in this way of like, um, from their experience, it really helped them. So it might be something to try. And that was the thing, was it was always something that you could try, and it wasn't a commitment. Um, I didn't know at the time that you don't just try transition most of the time. Um, Once you kind of dip your toes in, you're stuck, in a lot of cases. So I got it in my head that this was what was right for me, and I was an asshole about it. I was militant. I destroyed friendships, because I had friends who were saying like, "Well, maybe this isn't really a solution, to your trauma." And I was like, "No, no, 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 you're wrong. Like, this is the only way. This is the only thing I haven't tried yet. This has got to be what's right." Um, and to some degree, it's true that like I had tried so many medications. I tried so many different forms of therapy. I'd been in and out of doctor's offices, and nobody had really addressed the fact that I'd had all of this sexual trauma, and that it was linked to my sexual orientation in a way. Um, and that, I had lost my bodily autonomy, from such a young age, that really messed me up. No one really wanted to talk about it. Um, they wanted to talk about my depression, and they wanted to talk about, my suicidality, but they didn't want to talk about why those things existed. And I don't think a lot of doctors or therapists out there are prepared to have those dark conversations about sexual assaults and sexual violence and abuse. Um, because I think if I'd had someone who could have talked to me about those things and sat with me through how uncomfortable it is to talk about, then maybe things would have been different. But they weren't. So um, I sought out a gender therapist, and the trans woman who had kind of initiated all of this conversation and thoughts in my head, he said, there's a gender therapist I'm seeing, but I'm about to stop seeing her, and she's taking new patients. And why don't you come to our peer support group and try it out? And then if that seems like a good fit, then maybe you could do individual therapy sessions with the gender therapist. So I did. I went to a peer support group, and it was wild. There were um, it was kind of a balanced mix between men and women who were transitioning. Um, Most of us were in our late teens and early 20s, and a lot of us had previously been gay or lesbian. Um, and the gender therapist ran the or facilitated the peer support group. Then we like sort of led it ourselves. There was a lot of talk that about things that like I had only really heard in the YouTube videos that I'd watched. So talks about top surgery and binding and SRS and things like that, where I was like, wow, I'm actually hearing this in person from other people. And um, in talking with the other people there, um, it it really they they love bombed me. There was a lot of, your family and your friends will never understand you. They never understood me, so they're never going to understand you. But I understand you. I know what you've been through, and I know how to help you because it's what's helping me. Um, and unfortunately, I didn't see at the time how unhealthy that was. Um, that seeking help from other people who are not well and who have not processed their trauma is not a good solution. Um, it might help, I guess, facilitate finding a good solution. But in this case, there was a lot of love bombing, a lot of encouragement to isolate from anyone who might criticize transition as a solution. And that's never good. Um, Being in a situation where people are telling you to disregard any criticism and not even listen to it, that's not healthy. Um, and fortunately, I've learned that since. But it was not something I really was prepared for, um, and I I was ready for anything to resolve my problems. I was desperate. Um, and like I said, I'd been through what I thought were as many resources as I could find, and nothing I felt really helped me. So, um, there was this promise made by all these people who are transitioning of, look at how much happier I am, look at how much more fulfilled I am. And later, they would say the unspoken parts of, well, actually, I'm not as happy as I would be with surgery, or I'm not as happy as I would be with, all these things changed. Because there's always more. But when you're kind of first coming into it, you're not aware that there's always going to be more. You're never actually going to be complete and fully happy. There's always going to be something else. Now, what I haven't addressed is gender dysphoria. Now, some people who are critics of mine have said, well, you never had gender dysphoria. I think I did. I was very uncomfortable in my body. I was extremely uncomfortable touching myself and being intimate with myself. I and I had these feelings, and then they got worse the more I got involved in the trans community. Like, the more I talked about it with others, the more I was like constantly aware. Oh yeah, I'm uncomfortable with this part of my body. Like, if I don't think about it all the time, it's not as big of a deal. But when you're talking about all the time, you're thinking about all the time, you're constantly like, how do I fix this? It becomes a bigger problem. So I did have that going in, but it became worse as time went on. But after the first peer support group I went to and had all these kind of revelations, I made an appointment with a gender therapist, and right from the get-go, she was all about affirmation, and I feel like that word gets thrown around a lot, and I'm worried that it's going to lose its meaning, like so many other words have. But affirmation for me meant she refused to call me by any other name besides my trans name. She would only refer to me as he, unless I changed my pronouns. She was very much like, no, this is what you are. Because you said this is what you are, this is what you are. And coming from a therapist or a clinician of any kind, that's not good. You don't want to just take what someone says as 100%. I feel like everything needs to be cross-examined, especially when you're dealing with someone like those of us who've transitioned, who carry so much trauma. You need to question, okay, well, like, I understand you're having these feelings and you're having these thoughts, but let's talk about where this might have come from. And that was not done with my gender therapist. She even went as far as to say that the reason I had been sexually assaulted was that I was too manly, which doesn't make any sense, and is really insulting. But such was the case. She, from the first appointment, she was like, well, look, like, let's, our next appointment, I'll have a letter ready for you. You can take that to a doctor that I work with. They didn't work in the same clinic. I guess my gender therapist just referred people to this doctor because it was commonly known this doctor prescribed hormones like whenever. So she said, your next session, I'll have a letter for you. And you can take this letter to the doctor and it'll be fine. I told her about my diagnosis with depression and schizophrenia. I told her about my history with sexual assaults. I told her these things, and those things were ignored. I have a mental illness that causes extreme delusional thinking, and paranoia, and I can't process trauma in a healthy way on my own. So, and I have a lot of trauma. So none of that was taken into account. I was just raced into transition. So I saw a doctor shortly after I first was like, yo, I'm a trans man. Very soon after that initial, like, hey, I think this is what's right for me, it happened. And when I saw this doctor, she saw the letter, and like put it in my file. She talked a little bit about some things like family history of cancer. I told her also about my mental health history, was not addressed. Sorry, there's a train outside. Mostly we talked about what results would look like and what I would want to see. Sorry, that's a coffee maker. She gave me a few warnings. So the risk that I was told about with testosterone use was I might go bald, I might develop acne, I would almost certainly develop facial hair, and my voice would drop. She did tell me that my voice dropping might be reversible and that the hair loss might be reversible, both of which are not really true. I mean, some people have seen like a little bit of regrowth of hair from follicles that are not dead yet. Some people's voices kind of like shift a little bit. But, that's kind of a gray area and like a little bit of an exception. The general rule is these things are permanent. I was not told about risk of stroke or risk of heart disease, heart failure, risk of diabetes, risk of renal failure. I wasn't told about atrophy, vaginal atrophy. I wasn't told about uterine atrophy or ovarian failure. And I'll get to why this is important. But I wasn't told about any of these risks. And she tried to kind of cover herself by saying, well, this is a bit experimental, and most of my patients are men who take estrogen, so we'll kind of see as we go. Now that should be a big red flag to anybody getting involved, but it wasn't to me because I was already convinced. I was already like, well, it worked for all these other women, and ultimately this is the only solution left. So I agreed, and I signed an informed consent form, which I now currently look at as completely inappropriate. I don't think I was in a position mentally to consent. I don't think that I was informed of the risks enough to consent. So I feel like that was just garbage, to be honest. And unfortunately, it worked. It covered their butts. But I was not informed to consent. So within about a month, I went from, I think I'm trans, to being on testosterone. And the dosage that she put me on was what I now know is exceptionally high. I later compared my dosage to others, and I was on 3 times as much. I started off a little bit lower than 3 times as much to like get started, but she started me off really high because the assumption was start really high and the changes will happen faster, right? It wasn't totally wrong to think that way because within just a couple weeks, my voice started to crack and my throat hurt a lot. And I noticed like my skin started to change. I got really oily. And it was gross. I started getting acne. I was really sweaty all the time. And within about 3 months, I started noticing a really extreme change. So I started developing facial hair, and it was weird. It started more kind of ginger colored. With like the first like month or so, it started about ginger colored, but then about 3 months in, it was really dark. And 3 months in, my voice was pretty low compared to before. And by 6 months in, I noticed my hairline started to recede. Um, and those were all cosmetic changes that I kind of anticipated. Um, I mean, I didn't love the idea of going bald, but I kind of was willing to accept that. And something that's not talked about is um, the idea that you can transition to, I mean, it's not the whole reason, obviously, but like part of the reason I was happy with the physical changes was I felt I wouldn't be sexually attractive to men anymore. Um, of course, that all changed later. Um, but that was kind of my hope, right? Was that I wouldn't be seen as a sexual object by men anymore, and I wouldn't be treated the way women are treated. Um, so at first I was excited about these changes. I bound my breasts with at first ace bandage, and then I got a binder. Um, and Okay, sorry about that. I'm gonna try to edit this together. My roommate came home, so um, but yeah, as I was saying, I went from like not having really any idea of what trans was and just kind of having it as like an inclination to very shortly after being put on testosterone and a very high dose. And I appreciated the changes I saw for the most part. For about like 8 months, but then about 8 months in, I did start to feel kind of like something was off. I didn't really feel exactly like this was the wrong choice, but it didn't feel like the right choice either. Um, so I did talk to my gender therapist about it, and I mentioned, I'm having some feelings like I need to slow down or stop. I feel like this all may be going a little too fast. And her response was, "Oh, that's normal. Having regrets or feelings of things going too fast is totally normal. You just got to push through." Um, and she told me not to stop. Um, and so I listened because I figured she was the expert, and that maybe she was right. Maybe if I just keep going, I'll get to a place where I feel comfortable, and maybe these changes will start to feel normal. Um, but they didn't. And so for the next several years, things progressively changed more and more. My voice got fairly deep. My facial hair just kept getting thicker. Um, my hair loss got much more noticeable. Um, and I'm very fortunate that I didn't lose an exceptional amount of hair. But to me, it was noticeable. I used to have a much different hairline than what I have now. And as shallow as it may be, that was the first thing that I noticed that kind of made me pause, was losing a great amount of hair, like in the shower and stuff, and being like, oh my gosh, what's going on? Um, and again, I had been kind of told, there might be some hair loss. So I knew this might be part of it, but the reality of it happening was different. And trying to process like, oh, these these changes are real, it was difficult. Um, in this time, I lost an incredible amount of weight. My anorexia came back with a fury, and so barely eating, in addition to my metabolism changing from the testosterone use. I was about 90 pounds, and was just a walking skeleton. Um, and unfortunately, when you have eating disorder brain, um, when you see yourself looking sickly, that is in your mental illness. That's a sign of progress. That's a good thing. You romanticize that, and I did. I saw that as like, oh, this is great. I look sick. This is fantastic. Um, and so I felt encouraged to stay on it, partly because I knew if I stopped, I might gain weight. And I don't know of too many other women who've transitioned who had similar feelings, but I've talked to like a few who had similar feelings to that, that, you know, uh, there's more to it, but that a small part of why we stayed on testosterone was that we knew we would gain weight if we went off of it. And I think that can be coupled with some of the other changes that we knew would happen if we stopped. Like the fat redistribution that happens when you're on testosterone would go back to a more natural female fat distribution after stopping. And that's something that a lot of people who are trying to detransition are afraid of. Um, but yeah, so I was on testosterone for about 5 years, and well, I was on it about almost 6 years, but about four or 5 years in, I started to have hip problems. Now, I was born with congenital hip dysplasia, which means the pelvic bone and the hip joint doesn't have a socket in the pelvic bone. So when I was a baby, they ground away at the pelvic bone to create a socket, so that the bone could go into there. And then I was in physical therapy for a few years, and things like that. So I'm able to walk now, which is great. But the pelvic bone there is a little bit more fragile than what most people have. So and there's not really any cartilage or anything there. So um, uh, about 4 years in, I started having hip problems, and I'd fallen a few times and gotten some pretty nasty fractures, and ended up walking with a cane for about a year. And I never really attributed that to the fact that testosterone decreases bone density. Again, not something I was warned about or told about at all. But having a lack of estrogen in your system and having dominant testosterone affects women's bone health. Um, and so it made my bones a lot more fragile, and they were already fragile. So, so that happened. And um, again, I didn't make the connection at that point. I just thought it must be the hip dysplasia, right? Um, but then around the like 5.5 year mark, I ended up having signs of renal failure. So I was jaundiced and could barely walk. I was vomiting all the time. I was urinating blood. Um, I was in a lot of pain. And I saw my doctor. This was a new doctor. I had moved. So I was staying on the testosterone, but seeing a new doctor at this point. And she saw that like I was not at this point on any antidepressants or any other medications besides the testosterone. So she said, well, maybe let's like taper off the testosterone and see if that helps. So then she moved me from the injectable testosterone onto the gel testosterone. And that worked. That plus some diet changes and monitoring and stuff. She helped me reverse those issues. And I was really lucky that I didn't have to like go on dialysis or didn't progress any further. Um, but it was scary. And going down from the injectable to the gel was such a hard decision. And it sounds foolish, right? That like I prioritize this drug over my health. But I was so involved in the trans community and so committed to this identity that I'd been living for, 5+ years that it was really it was really hard to reckon with the fact that maybe this drug that I'd been taking was actually causing me harm and not helping me. I still had suicidal ideation. I still had all my trauma. If anything, I was more mentally ill because I was dealing with extreme paranoia, worse than I'd had before. My relationships were rocky at best. I was, you know, constantly just having like so much trauma because I would go crazy. And I didn't like every day I woke up, I was like, I don't want to live. And when I would talk about that feeling with other trans people, their reaction was, well, that's transphobia. You're just internalizing transphobia from everybody else. It wasn't talked about that, like, maybe this thing that was presented as a solution is not actually a solution. Maybe this is not actually helping, and is in fact contributing to my problems. So after I tapered down to the gel, I talked to some of my trans friends and I told them like, hey, I need to stop. I need to stop testosterone. Like this drug is like killing me. I can't do this. And their reaction was appalling. I was called a transphobe. I was told I was a traitor. I was told to never tell anybody that I'd had medical problems because of it. People told me that if I detransitioned, they'd never talk to me again, or that if I detransitioned, that they'd want me dead. It was horrible. And I had one trans friend who went so far, this was a trans woman, who went so far as to put out a hit on me on Facebook saying, if you see this person, beat the shit out of them, they're a transphobe. And this person came to my work looking for me to beat me up, waited outside of my therapy for me. It was horrible, just stalking me and harassing me. And that really scared me. And it got me thinking too, these were the same people who said they were going to love me no matter what, who told me they loved me and understood me better than my other friends or family. This was supposed to be my new family. This was supposed to be a group that loved me unconditionally, but there were conditions. And so then I started thinking, I'd heard a little bit about what detransition was, and about people who did it, but I didn't really know any stories. And I thought, okay, the few times I've talked to people about it, they all said, don't look into stories, don't talk to those people. And I was like, what if I actually just do read these stories? because I hate being told what to read and what not to read, because that's fascist. Um, so I found a story by Katie Herzog in a Seattle newspaper, and it was about detransitioners like myself. Um, and it was these stories of these women who had been through a lot of what I had been through, um, and it got me thinking more like, okay, so if they can do it, maybe I can do it too. But I didn't know where to start, and I didn't know what it meant to detransition. I didn't know that it was more than just stopping the testosterone and stopping living as a trans man. So I first started where I detransitioned medically, and then very soon after, I was like, okay, I need to be done with being trans because I can't I can't be with these people. I can't be in this group. They excommunicated me. So, and I hadn't even fully detransitioned yet. They already excommunicated me. So I was like, okay, so what if I'm not a trans man? That means I'm a woman again. What does that mean? Um, and I started to look for other women like me. And I found some videos again on YouTube. I started talking with some women who detransitioned. And um, the main thing that I found interesting that was different was that, yes, we all had a lot in common, just like I'd had a lot in common with the people I talked to before I transitioned. But in this case, none of these people said, I have something that'll fix you. And so they said, okay, you need to work on yourself and you need therapy. And this is a process that you're going to have to take on. And there's going to be a lot of work and it's going to suck. But transition isn't a cure. There's no one cure for all of your problems. And that was like hard medicine to take, was hearing you got a lot of baggage and it can't all be resolved with one thing. And I think that's part of the misunderstanding by people who see detransitioners and think, well, how did you not know that like this wouldn't fix you? It's because we're desperate. We're desperate and the resources are not there to handle this shit. A lot of us have extreme trauma. A lot of us have things that go back to when we were prepubescent, and are just ingrained in our brains. And to have somebody hand you something on a platter and say, yeah, this is going to fix it, that's very tempting. And to come out of that, it's really hard to acknowledge, okay, there's not one thing that's going to fix it. In fact, a lot of this stuff can't really be fixed. It can just be managed. And that's really heartbreaking in a lot of ways. And it can be hard to not feel like, crap, am I broken? Am I just forever this way? Am I forever miserable? But you don't have to be. So after I started talking to these women and thinking about it, I decided that I needed to detransition like fully and be in it. So I started working on myself. And I was still dating men. And I haven't really talked about my experience in the trans community or the social aspect of it. To be honest, I don't really want to talk about that right now. But needless to say, I got roped back into being with men during that time. And it's it's an environment that promotes, loving everybody, which means opening your legs to everybody. So you're not allowed to have really an exclusive sexual orientation. If you do, you're looked down on, and kind of pushed to the corner. Especially if you're, like a trans man who wants to be with a woman, you're essentially a lesbian couple. And that's extremely frowned upon. So I got roped into being with men. When I detransitioned, I was with a man at the time, but I was really struggling because I knew that I was a lesbian at heart, but I couldn't accept it because there's the knowing and there's the accepting. And it can be really difficult to accept something even though you know it's true. So I tried really hard still to be with this man, and it was not a healthy relationship. But while I was going through that, I ended up having a medical incident happen where I eventually was diagnosed with endometriosis. And in this process, I saw one doctor who prescribed me Lupron, also a drug used for puberty blockers. This drug debilitated me. I was paralyzed. I couldn't walk. My hair fell out in clumps. I couldn't eat anything. It ruined me. So because of the effects of that drug, I was like, that is terrible. I'd rather have endometriosis. Come to find out, Lupron doesn't actually even take care of endometriosis because endometriosis, for those who don't know, is a disease that affects the organs around the uterus. It's a disease that progresses similar to cancer. It is not cancer, but it progresses similar to cancer in that it goes very fast and takes things over. There's also adenomyosis, which is when this disease takes over the uterus. And so they're a little different, but usually the uterus is affected in that the organs outside of the uterus can become diseased, and then it can spread to the uterus, causing adenomyosis, the whole thing. So this disease, usually there's signs fairly early on, usually, right when you hit puberty, your periods are different. You have really bad cramping and stuff. I had none of that. And it turns out that endometriosis can be triggered by a sudden influx of estrogen. So essentially, me going off of testosterone caused a surge of estrogen to happen, and that caused endometriosis. I don't think that I would have had this if I had not gotten testosterone. I don't know, and I'm not a doctor, but that's my theory. So I eventually found a specialist who was really great. She taught me a lot about the disease. She taught me a lot about my anatomy. I honestly didn't know that much about my own reproductive organs until I met her and she explained things to me. And she treated me with respect. And every step of the way, she said, there are risks, and here are the risks, and here are the various methods of treatment, and here's what I do, and here's what other people do, and you need to make some choices. So the first choice was to get a laparoscopic surgery to kind of go in, view what the disease was looking like inside, because it doesn't come up on ultrasound. You have to go into the body to actually see it. So to go in there, and then also she said she would cut away what she could. And so she did that. I healed a little bit, but then about a year later, the endometriosis came back, and it came back with adenomyosis affecting my uterus. And so the discussion came to your uterus is really diseased. You're not going to be able to have kids, or at least not without lots of complications. And I'd already kind of made the decision that I didn't want to biologically have children anyway. Um, and she said, how do you feel about a hysterectomy? And she went over the risks. There are numerous risks with hysterectomy. I've known a lot of women who were transitioning who got hysterectomies like it was something that they ordered off a menu. And let me tell you, it is not a frivolous surgery to have. It increases risk of cancer. It increases risk of dementia. It it's hell to heal from. So she told me about these things, but I still said, you know what, I'm in so much pain. I don't want to have kids, and the disease was starting to spread to my bladder, and so she wanted to get as much of the disease out as possible before it spread more to my bladder, because then I wouldn't be able to use my bladder any longer. So I said, okay, let's get all the disease out. That's my priority. Let's get all the disease out. And so she did. She took out my uterus and cut away at other parts that were diseased. And after my hysterectomy, I realized the toll that testosterone had taken on me, because what's not talked about is if you take testosterone, you have vaginal atrophy and pelvic muscle atrophy. That combined with the trauma of hysterectomy creates intense weakness. Your pelvic muscles are really weak, and the vaginal tissue is thin, so everything hurts, and it's just not fun. But through lots of work, I healed from that surgery. And once I healed from that surgery, I had kind of a weird change in my mentality. I realized that I kind of needed to prioritize things that I really wanted, and that I wasn't going to continue to try to be something that I wasn't. So I started seeing a therapist. I talked about a lot of my issues. He was okay. He didn't understand everything, and we couldn't talk about everything. He did call me a turf, so that was fun. For mentioning that I had a lot of problems from using testosterone. But he did help me work through some of my issues, and I left the man I was with, and I came out, and I said, okay, I can't go back. I can't pretend anymore. I'm a lesbian. It's a fact. It's been eating away at me for years, and I can't destroy myself just because it's easier for others. And that was extremely liberating. It was a little bit late, but it's been really great to be honest about myself, and to not feel like I'm trying to be something else. I remember when I was younger, I would, periodically see a happy lesbian couple out in the wild, and I'd look at them with so much jealousy. Not just because they'd found each other, but also because I thought, I can't be that. And I didn't understand how I could be that. Um, and that I was the one who was holding myself back. Um, but um, but I'm really happy now that I'm out. And yeah, so I came out. And as the years went on, I did some interviews and I talked to some people, but um, it detransition is its own process. And it's taking all of these things that we've repressed and tried to combine together into one thing. And unfortunately, it's not quite that simple. They might all be related, but they're still separate things. Um, and you have to kind of work on one while you're working on everything else. And so I've worked a lot on the trauma I had from my father's sexual abuse. Um, and that's helped a lot. My next steps are to work on the trauma I've had from the other times that I've been raped and sexually assaulted, and to work on my disordered eating habits. Um, I've worked a lot on my depression and my suicidal ideation. Um, I'm medicated for my schizophrenia, which has helped a lot. Um, uh, a lot of people are very anti any sort of medicalization, who are, anti-transition. They're also like, you don't need to medicalize mental health. And to a certain extent, I agree. I think that a lot of people are over medicated. Um, but I will say antipsychotics have helped me a lot. I'm on a very low dose. It keeps me stable. It keeps me from irrational, delusional thinking. It keeps me in a state where I can feel grounded enough to come to terms with things myself and navigate relationships myself without my mental illness sort of taking over. Um, so that's where I stand on it. And so I've worked on all of that over the last 6 years that I've been detransitioned. And it's been a really hard road. It's still going on. I still have lots of work to do. I still have some what we might call gender dysphoria. I call it sex anxiety because it's anxiety around my sex. It's anxiety around being seen as a woman. It's anxiety around my genitalia and the parts of my body that have been violated. And that comes from trauma. And it comes from a lack of safety. And so I'm working on that. And where I am now, I have an amazing fiance. I found someone who understands and encourages me to keep working on myself and to better myself. I have a stable job. I have a stable living situation. And I see a future. When I first started to transition, I did it because I could not see a future for myself as a woman. I thought I'd rather die than keep living as a woman. So transition was an alternative to death. And it was marketed that way. I was told if you don't transition, you will die. So that was reinforced. But I see now I can have a future. Anyone who has transitioned, who comes out of it and thinks, "Oh God, what have I done? I'll never have anything." That's simply not true. you can have a happy and fulfilling future. It takes work, and sometimes it's really hard, but you can. You can find happiness, you can find fulfillment. And reminding myself that I am not what others see me as. I am myself. I am my body. My body is a part of who I am. My experiences are female experiences. And that I get to determine the boundaries for my body. And it's all been very important. But I don't misunderstand why people choose to transition, particularly why women transition. There's a lot of different factors for every single person. But, you know, who wants to be a woman in a lot of ways? You know, there's so much telling us that if we don't fit into certain boxes, if we don't take everything with a smile, if we don't submit, then we're not really women. We're not really proper women. And it's hard not to internalize that. And the homophobia, it's still around. Yeah, we have made some great strides, but homophobia is still around. It's still a factor, and we can't pretend that it's gone away, because that's how we end up with girls who feel wrong because of who they are. So I hope this has shed some light on why I have an opinion on all of this stuff. And I think, anyone who's considering detransition needs to understand that it's a lot of work, but if you keep putting it off, it's not going to go away. That pain, that trauma, those mental health issues, they're not going to go away. In fact, they might get worse. They might fester and get worse. And you kind of have to take the plunge and hopefully find someone to help you. Find someone in therapy. Find a trusted friend who can help you work through that. It's really hard. I know, because finding a therapist out there now who's not going to just encourage you to keep on ignoring those things. Finding a therapist who's not going to do that is really challenging. But they do exist. And, do it for yourself. You deserve to work on those things and to get past some of it. You might not conquer all of it. You might not feel very different right at first. I know I'm not selling it great, but it takes time. There's not a cure. There's not a fix-it-all solution. It's just work and time and patience and love and reflection. And that's what I've learned over the last 6 years I've been detransitioned. And I hope that this has helped. Thank you.